In front of the executive board, Chief Executive Victoria Ashbourne dropped Adrian Cole's file on the floor and laughed, calling him nothing more than a warehouse manager who had wandered into a room for serious people. When Adrian warned her the number she presented could sink the company, Victoria smiled and told him to go ahead and call anyone he wanted. Adrian did not argue. He picked up his file, lifted his phone, set it on speaker, and dialed one saved number. When the chairman answered by his full title, the room changed, and Victoria realized the man she had humiliated held the vote deciding her future. If you enjoy watching arrogant executives get exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button now and stay for how far this one falls. Adrian Cole had worked the distribution floor of Ashbourne Dynamics for almost 3 years, and in that time he had become the kind of employee other managers quietly relied on, without ever thinking out loud. He could recall shipping routes from memory, catch a mislabeled pallet before it left the dock, and calm down an angry supplier in under 2 minutes. Yet he almost never stayed for the after-hours drinks or the birthday cakes in the executive lounge. Every evening, without exception, he clocked out on time and drove his aging pickup truck across town to pick up his daughter from her after-school program, because since his wife had passed away 4 years ago, there had been no one else to do it. Victoria Ashbourne had noticed this pattern long before she ever learned his name properly, and she had drawn her own conclusions from it. During one of her rare walkthroughs of the distribution center, she watched Adrian decline an invitation to an unnecessary evening meeting and later remarked to a nearby director that the company might be better served by someone who was not, as she put it, weighed down by personal complications. Adrian happened to be close enough to hear her, and he answered without raising his voice, telling her that his shift currently ran at the highest efficiency rating in the entire regional network, a fact she could verify in the very reports sitting on her desk. Victoria could not dispute the number, so instead she looked him over, took in the worn truck in the parking lot and the inexpensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame, and remarked idly that some people were simply built for small jobs. It was a small cruelty, delivered lightly, the kind that leaves no bruise anyone else can see, and it was far from the last one she would offer him. Adrian had been raised by parents who valued steadiness over spectacle, and that upbringing had shaped the way he carried himself long before Ashbourne Dynamics ever appeared on his resume, long before the loss that had reshaped his priorities all over again. Before joining the company, he had spent nearly a decade working supply chain fraud cases for a consulting firm that contracted with manufacturers across 3 states, quietly untangling schemes that companies preferred to handle privately rather than through the courts. He was good at it, methodical and unflinching, in a way that made executives nervous when he walked into a room. But the travel and the late nights had eaten away at the time he had with his wife and daughter, until there was almost nothing left. When his wife passed away suddenly, the choice to step back from that career had not felt like a sacrifice so much as a correction, a chance to be present for the one relationship that mattered more than any case file ever had. He took the position at Ashbourne Dynamics because it offered predictable hours and a straightforward role, never imagining that predictability would eventually become the very disguise his former colleagues on a certain board would ask him to wear again. What she did not know and would not learn for many weeks was that Adrian had already been asked by 3 members of her own board to look far more closely at the numbers she was so proud of. The trouble started for Adrian on an ordinary Tuesday when he was reconciling shipment logs and noticed the same container number attached to 6 different customer accounts within the same fiscal quarter. At first, he assumed a clerical error, the kind that happens when a temporary worker copies a template incorrectly. But when he pulled the physical inventory records, he found that all 6 of those shipments, worth more than $18 million combined, were still sitting untouched in the warehouse behind him. The delivery confirmations attached to the file bore signatures from employees who had left the company months earlier, names Adrian recognized because he personally processed their exit paperwork.
He brought the discrepancy to Mara Quinn, the inventory control specialist 2 desks down, who went pale before he had even finished the sentence. Mara admitted quietly and with her office door closed that she had flagged similar irregularities before, only to be told by someone above her to adjust the figures so they would match the targets promised for the quarter. She did not name names directly, but her eyes drifted toward the glass-walled executive suite on the far side of the building, and Adrian did not need her to say anything more. He asked her only to preserve the legitimate records she already had lawful access to, careful not to reveal that he had been quietly authorized 3 months earlier to look into exactly this kind of pattern. Mara asked him twice whether he intended to report what they had found, and both times Adrian answered honestly that he did not yet know enough to say, a response that seemed to steady her more than any false reassurance would have. What Adrian pieced together over the following days was worse than a bookkeeping mistake. Contracts for equipment that hadn't yet been manufactured were being logged as completed revenue, inflating the company's apparent growth ahead of a merger that would make Victoria and a handful of investors extraordinarily wealthy. If the deal closed on falsified numbers, the shortfall would surface after the ink had dried, by which point ordinary employees would likely lose their jobs while Victoria walked away with her bonus already banked.
Adrian encrypted a preliminary summary and sent it to Conrad Whitmore, the board chairman who had brought him into this arrangement in the first place, and Conrad's reply was brief: "Wait, gather more," because the board needed proof that Victoria had given the order herself rather than an overzealous subordinate acting alone. Adrian understood the caution, even as it frustrated him, because an accusation against a sitting chief executive that later proved incomplete would not only fail, it would destroy the credibility of anyone who ever tried to raise the same concern again. He spent the following nights after his daughter had gone to sleep, cross-referencing purchase orders against manufacturing timelines, building a spreadsheet that traced each falsified shipment back to its exact week its corresponding contract had been signed. What emerged was a pattern too consistent to be accidental, a rhythm of inflated numbers that always landed just before quarterly reports went out to investors, as though someone were deliberately smoothing over gaps that should never have existed in the first place. Mara, growing more anxious by the day, began making quietly backup copies of legitimate records onto a personal drive, terrified that the originals might vanish the way the conference recording already had. She confided to Adrian that 2 other employees in her department had been transferred without explanation after asking similar questions months earlier, both reassigned to distant facilities where their objections would carry considerably less weight. Adrian recognized the tactic immediately, having seen versions of it before in his previous line of work, a slow, deniable way of removing inconvenient voices without ever technically firing anyone. 4 days later, Adrian discovered that a recorded conference call referencing the shipment numbers had been deleted from the company server exactly 10 minutes after he had accessed the shipping logs, and he understood with a cold certainty that someone was now watching him just as closely as he was watching them. Victoria learned within a week that someone inside the company was quietly pulling apart the shipment records tied to her growth numbers, and the news put her in a mood that rippled through every department she touched. She summoned her department heads into a closed conference room and demanded to know who among their staff might be disloyal enough to go digging where they had no business digging. Behind the scenes, she had access privileges rewritten, edit history scrubbed, and select files quietly migrated to a private external server where board oversight could not easily reach them. What she did not anticipate was that Adrian, having done this kind of work before in a different life, had already requested that the system automatically timestamp every modification made to shipment and revenue records, a request buried so deep in an administrative settings menu that nobody thought to check it. When Victoria's assistant summoned Adrian to the executive floor, he expected confrontation, and he was not disappointed.
Victoria opened warmly, almost kindly, asking about his daughter and remarking on how difficult it must be raising a child alone while working long shifts, before pivoting without any real transition into a suggestion that a single father might be better served chasing a steady paycheck than playing amateur detective. He offered him a raise, generous enough to raise his eyebrows, in exchange for a signed statement confirming the shipment discrepancies were simple data entry errors and nothing more. He told her evenly that he had spent enough years watching companies unravel from small, ignored discrepancies to know that signing his name to a lie would not make the underlying problem disappear. It would simply delay the moment everyone had to face it, usually at a much higher cost. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying him the way she might study a contract clause she did not like, and reminded him that plenty of qualified people would be glad to have his position, people who understood the value of loyalty to the leadership that employed them. Adrian declined calmly and watched her expression shift from warmth into something considerably colder. She threatened to document him as uncooperative with executive leadership, a phrase that could end careers quietly and without explanation. And Adrian only asked, without any edge in his voice, why a chief executive would personally concern herself with a handful of misfiled container numbers. He asked it plainly, without accusation in his tone, the way he might ask about any other operational detail, and that plainness seemed to unsettle her more than open confrontation would have. The question landed harder than he expected. For one unguarded second, Victoria's composure cracked, and in that second, Adrian saw exactly what he needed to see. Enjoying the story so far? A quick subscription helps us keep bringing you stories like this. Now let's see what Victoria does next. She knew to the dollar what those 6 shipments were worth, and she knew it far too precisely for someone claiming ignorance of the problem. Victoria's paranoia did not stop at the finance and shipping departments. She began questioning why her own assistant had scheduled a meeting with a warehouse supervisor at all, and quietly reviewed months of internal correspondence, searching for the moment someone might have tipped him off. She found nothing incriminating, because Adrian had been careful from the start never to put a single suspicion in writing. But the absence of evidence did little to calm her. Victoria called in a private security consultant she had used before for sensitive matters, a man who specialized in discreetly monitoring employees without the usual internal alerts, and instructed him to watch Adrian's badge activity, his printer usage, and the hours he spent logged in to the shared drive. The consultant reported back that Adrian's behavior looked, on the surface, almost suspiciously ordinary, which only deepened Victoria's conviction that he was hiding something worth finding. Rattled by how much Adrian seemed to already know, Victoria ordered her technology director to quietly examine his work computer overnight, and what they found unsettled her far more than reassured her. Buried among ordinary shift schedules and inventory spreadsheets sat a folder labeled Board Review, encrypted and inaccessible with credentials none of her people possessed. Victoria became convinced, not unreasonably from her vantage point, that Adrian was assembling a case against her, and she decided against a quiet dismissal.
A man erased without explanation might simply resurface elsewhere with his evidence intact. But a man discredited publicly in front of colleagues who would remember the humiliation would carry doubt about his own competence wherever he went next. She arranged for Adrian to be pulled into the quarterly executive review, a meeting well above his formal pay grade, and had a subordinate quietly alter the figures tied to his department so that his own numbers would appear to contradict the company's official reporting. Adrian arrived at the executive conference room a few minutes early, carrying his own carefully reconciled figures in a plain folder, aware that whatever numbers Victoria had prepared for the meeting would not match the reality he had documented on the warehouse floor. The room filled slowly with senior leaders in tailored suits, most of whom barely acknowledged him beyond a curious glance, unaccustomed to seeing someone from operations at a table usually reserved for finance and strategy.
Victoria arrived last, walking in with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how the meeting would end, and took her seat at the head of the table without so much as a greeting in Adrian's direction. She opened with a summary of the company's supposed growth for the quarter, numbers that sounded impressive read aloud, but bore little resemblance to what Adrian had spent weeks verifying against physical inventory. In the meeting itself, Victoria turned to him in front of nearly a dozen senior leaders and demanded he explain why his division had, in her words, lost track of millions of dollars in inventory. Adrian answered plainly that nothing had been lost. It had instead been recorded as delivered, while sitting, fully accounted for, inside the warehouse the entire time. Victoria cut him off before he could finish, describing him as a shift supervisor, attempting to sound more sophisticated than the finance professionals who actually understood the business. A few executives laughed along, not because they found it genuinely funny, but because laughing along with Victoria was, in that building, the safer choice. She added that Adrian might do better to focus on getting home on time, rather than involving himself in decisions far above his position, a remark that drew a sharp intake of breath from at least one director, who clearly recognized how far Victoria had just crossed a line most executives instinctively avoided. Adrian did not flinch. He had spent years listening to people underestimate him precisely because he chose his family over ambition, and he had long ago stopped expecting fairness from those who mistook quiet discipline for weakness. He simply waited for her to finish, unwilling to give her the reaction she seemed to be fishing for. Adrian offered once more to walk the room through the reconciled figures page by page, noting calmly that any director present was welcome to compare them against the warehouse's physical inventory at any hour they chose. Not a single executive at the table took him up on the offer, most avoiding his gaze entirely, unwilling to be the one who publicly sided against the woman who controlled their bonuses and their futures within the company. Adrian set his folder of reconciled figures on the table, and Victoria, without so much as glancing at it, swept it onto the floor and told security to wait outside the door, announcing to the room that Adrian would be terminated immediately for accessing confidential data without authorization. Before the security officers could step forward, Adrian asked her one last question, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear it. Did she want to review the evidence before making her decision final? Victoria's laugh was sharp and short, and she told her with the confidence of someone who had never once been made to answer for anything in that building, to call anyone she wanted because it would not change a single thing about what happened next. If this story has you hooked, subscribe now, because everything changes with the very next phone call. Adrian bent down and gathered his scattered papers unhurriedly, showing no trace of panic or anger, and Victoria mistook his silence for surrender, the same way she had mistook his punctuality for a lack of ambition and his humility for a lack of intelligence. She instructed security to collect his badge and escort him out through the loading dock rather than the front entrance, a small final cruelty meant to send a message to anyone watching. Adrian reached into his jacket, lifted his phone, and dialed a number saved under a single first name. Victoria mocked him openly, asking whether he was calling a lawyer or perhaps a babysitter, and a few of the laughing executives from earlier laughed again, though with noticeably less conviction. Adrian set the phone on speaker without a word. On the second ring, a measured, unhurried voice answered, giving his full title as chairman of the Ashbourne Dynamics board, and confirming for the record that the call was being logged in accordance with a standing board resolution. The air in the room changed instantly, the way it does when everyone realizes at once that they misjudged a situation badly. Conrad Whitmore instructed Victoria to remain exactly where she was and to touch no device, digital or otherwise, until further notice. Victoria attempted to recover her footing, insisting that Adrian was manipulating data to seek some kind of personal revenge for being disciplined, but Adrian simply read aloud a short authorization code, and within 90 seconds, the conference room monitor lit up with 6 board members joining remotely from 3 different states. Conrad confirmed plainly and without theater that Adrian was not an ordinary warehouse employee, but a special investigative representative appointed by the audit committee placed inside the distribution center specifically to determine whether the executive suite's reported numbers matched what was actually happening on the ground. Victoria stared at him as though seeing him for the first time, then quickly argued that no board could remove a sitting CEO on the word of one undercover employee alone. Adrian agreed with her completely and told her he had not called to make an accusation. He had called to present the evidence that she herself had just confirmed in this very room, in front of everyone present.
The other executives who had laughed along with Victoria minutes earlier now sat frozen, unsure whether to look at her or at the screen, where 6 unfamiliar faces waited in careful silence, each one a stranger to most of the people in that room, but clearly no stranger to the situation unfolding in front of them. Victoria glanced toward the door as though considering whether she could simply leave, but Conrad's voice cut through any such thought before it fully formed, reminding her calmly that walking out now would itself be treated as an admission relevant to the board's decision. She sat back down, arms crossed, her earlier confidence replaced by something far brittle, and waited for whatever came next. The evidence unfolded in 3 distinct layers, and each one closed off another avenue of escape. Adrian began with the shipment discrepancies themselves, sharing a live video feed from the warehouse floor, showing the 6 containers still sealed, untouched, their serial numbers matching precisely the invoices Victoria had submitted as completed sales in the prior quarter's report. Geolocation records confirmed that not a single delivery truck tied to those container numbers had ever left the facility, a detail that made the falsification impossible to explain away as a shipping delay. Victoria insisted the entries could have been made by an assistant using her login credentials without her knowledge, a familiar excuse that Adrian had heard before in a different life doing exactly this kind of work. He moved to the second layer, restoring the edit history from a backup server that Victoria's technology director had not known existed, showing that the account issuing direct instructions to book the revenue early belonged unmistakably to her, verified against biometric login data and a network address traced to her private office. The timestamps aligned precisely with entries in her own personal calendar, a level of specificity no assistant could have manufactured on her behalf. Adrian noted without any particular emphasis that the instructions had been issued not from her office desktop, but from a personal laptop she carried between home and headquarters, a detail that made the claim of an unauthorized assistant even harder to sustain, since that laptop rarely left her possession. One board member, previously silent throughout the call, asked directly whether the finance department had ever raised objections internally before complying with those instructions, and Victoria hesitated just long enough for the pause itself to answer the question. With her first excuse gone, Victoria fell silent, and Adrian moved to the third and final layer. Conrad played back the recording from Victoria's private meeting with Adrian, capturing her offer of a raise in exchange for a false statement, her threat to mark him uncooperative, and her subsequent order to have data quietly removed from the server, all lawfully documented under the same investigative authority that had placed Adrian inside the company. Victoria's voice rose for the first time since the call began, insisting that recordings could be edited and timestamps manipulated by anyone with sufficient access, grasping at explanations that grew thinner with each word she spoke. Conrad reminded her, without raising his own voice at all, that the recording had been preserved under a chain of custody established the moment Adrian's investigation began, verified independently by a third party the board had retained, specifically to avoid this kind of dispute.
Later, Victoria accused him of engineering the entire encounter as a trap, and Adrian answered simply that he had given her multiple opportunities to review the numbers honestly, and each time she had chosen humiliation and dismissal instead. Mara Quinn was brought into the room at Conrad's request, and she hesitated at the doorway for a moment before stepping fully inside, her eyes briefly meeting Adrian's as though searching for permission to finally say what she had been carrying for months. She confirmed in a steady voice that surprised even her that she had personally been instructed to alter inventory figures months earlier, and she described in specific and unembellished detail the exact meeting where the instruction had been given and the exact words used to make clear that her continued employment depended on compliance. Victoria turned on Mara immediately, warning her that she would regret speaking, and in doing so demonstrated exactly the kind of retaliation the board had just heard described only moments before. Conrad let the silence sit for a long moment before announcing without any satisfaction in his tone that all three conditions required under the emergency resolution had now been met, and he asked Adrian to exercise the authority the board had granted him 3 months earlier. Adrian stood, straightened the folder Victoria had thrown to the floor, and read from a printed copy of the board's emergency measure, identified by its formal reference number 47B. Under its terms, Victoria's operational authority was suspended with immediate effect, her building access revoked, her banking authorizations frozen, and her contract signing privileges terminated on the spot. Victoria argued that her family had founded this company, that no one in that room had the standing to remove her from it, and Conrad reminded her evenly that the Ashbourne family had sold the overwhelming majority of its ownership stake years earlier, and that a chief executive's chair was not an inheritance passed down by blood. Victoria's voice cracked slightly on her next attempt, and for the first time since the meeting began, she seemed genuinely to grasp that the outcome was no longer within her control, that the confidence which had carried her through every previous confrontation in this building had finally run out of room to maneuver. The board proceeded immediately to a formal vote, and the silence that settled over the video feed as each member cast a verbal decision felt heavier than anything spoken aloud in the entire meeting. 5 members voted to terminate her employment for cause, 1 abstained on procedural grounds, and 1 recused himself entirely due to a personal conflict of interest disclosed earlier in the call. Victoria watched the tally accumulate on the screen in front of her with an expression that shifted from disbelief to something closer to quiet fury, though she said nothing further as each vote landed. The stated grounds were falsification of financial reporting, obstruction of a lawful internal investigation, and retaliation against an employee who had cooperated with that investigation. Because the termination was for cause, the severance clause built into her contract, one that would otherwise have guaranteed her a substantial payout, was voided under the same vote. Conrad asked Adrian, as the representative physically present at headquarters, to deliver the board's decision to Victoria directly. Adrian looked at her and said plainly that she was not being removed because she had insulted him personally, though she certainly had many times in front of many witnesses. She was being removed because she built her entire career on the belief that people in lower positions were not important enough to ever uncover the truth about what she was doing. He instructed the security officers, the same 2 who had been waiting to escort him out only minutes earlier, to escort Victoria from the executive floor.
And he added without irony that they were to treat her with the same professionalism and dignity that company policy required for any departing employee, a courtesy she had not extended to him. The contrast between his composure and the way she had thrown his file to the floor was not lost on anyone left in the room. Just before she was escorted out, Victoria turned back with one final claim, announcing that the entire finance department would stand behind her rather than a board she called reckless and disloyal. Everett Langford, the chief financial officer who had signed off on the falsified reports out of fear rather than conviction, opened his laptop at that exact moment and transmitted to the board a set of internal directives he had quietly preserved for months.
evidence he had kept not to expose Victoria immediately, but to protect himself if this day ever came. Those records revealed something even the board had not yet uncovered. Victoria had scheduled the sale of a significant portion of her personal shares to take effect the moment the merger was publicly announced, timing that only made sense if she already knew the company's true financial condition would not survive close scrutiny. The board immediately referred the entire matter to financial regulators and an independent auditing firm, and the merger, still weeks from finalizing, was placed on indefinite hold before outside investors could be drawn into a deal built on numbers that did not exist. The company was forced to restate its revenue publicly, a painful and embarrassing process, but one that spared it from a far larger collapse that would have come months later had the merger closed as planned. Financial reporters who had barely noticed Ashbourne Dynamics before suddenly took interest in the story, and for a brief and uncomfortable stretch, the company's name appeared in headlines describing the unraveling of an executive who had built her public image on confidence and pedigree rather than substance. Regulators moved deliberately, interviewing dozens of employees over several weeks, and eventually confirmed what the board had already suspected, that Victoria had known for well over a year that the underlying numbers could not support the valuation she was pushing toward investors. The independent auditors who combed through years of records found additional irregularities beyond the 6 shipments Adrian had first uncovered, smaller but no less deliberate adjustments scattered across multiple quarters, each one individually forgettable but collectively damning when laid side by side. Victoria's attorneys attempted to characterize the entire episode as a series of honest miscalculations rather than intentional fraud, but the recorded conversation from her private meeting with Adrian, along with the timing of her personal share sale, made that argument difficult to sustain in any serious forum. In the days that followed, several of the executives who had laughed along with Victoria during Adrian's public humiliation grew visibly anxious, clearly expecting some form of retaliation now that the balance of power had shifted so completely. Adrian chose a different path than the one many of them had feared. He drew a clear distinction between those who had actively engineered the fraud and those who had simply gone along with instructions out of fear for their own positions, refusing to treat every uncomfortable silence as an act of betrayal. Mara Quinn was formally protected under the company's whistleblower policy and placed in charge of designing a new internal verification system meant to catch exactly the kind of discrepancy she had once been too afraid to report. Everett was suspended pending a full review of his own conduct, though his decision to cooperate fully with the investigation was noted as a significant mitigating factor in his case. He met with Adrian privately once near the end of the review process and admitted that he had spent years telling himself he was simply following instructions from someone with more authority than he had, a justification that felt reasonable in the moment and increasingly hollow every time he repeated it to himself afterwards. Adrian did not offer him absolution, but he did not pile on additional judgment either, telling Everett only that the review board would weigh his cooperation fairly and that what happened next was largely up to the choices he made going forward. Mara, meanwhile, threw herself into designing the new verification system with an intensity that surprised even her own supervisors, driven by a determination to build something that would make it structurally difficult for any future executive to pressure a lower-level employee into silence the way she had once been pressured. Within a few months, her system had already caught 2 minor discrepancies elsewhere in the company, neither one malicious, both quickly corrected, proof to everyone watching that the new process actually worked rather than existing merely for appearances. In the days immediately following Victoria's removal, the company's legal team scrambled to prepare a public statement, and early drafts leaned heavily on vague language about leadership transitions and strategic realignment, the kind of phrasing designed to say almost nothing while sounding reassuring. Adrian read one of these drafts and rejected it outright, arguing that employees who had spent years trusting leadership deserved a plain explanation of what actually happened, rather than a carefully engineered non-answer. Conrad, somewhat to the surprise of the communications team, backed him fully, noting that the board's credibility going forward depended on demonstrating they had actually learned something from the entire ordeal. Adrian insisted that the company communicate honestly with its workforce rather than hide behind vague corporate language designed to obscure what had actually happened. He asked to hold that announcement not in the executive boardroom, but on the warehouse floor itself, the same floor Victoria had once walked through while calling the people working it small and replaceable. Standing between the same shelves where 6 falsified shipments had once sat sealed and untouched, Adrian told the assembled staff plainly that the company was heading into several difficult months and that he would not allow the consequences of executive dishonesty to fall entirely onto the people who did nothing wrong. He answered questions directly, admitted what remained uncertain, and made no promises he could not keep about how quickly things would stabilize. Workers who had spent years avoiding eye contact with anyone above them on the org chart found themselves, almost without planning it, standing up and applauding, not because Adrian now held power over them, but because he used the power he was given to protect people who had never expected anyone above them to bother. It was a small moment in the life of a large company, but for many of the people in that room, it was the first time in years that leadership had felt like something other than a threat. In the weeks after the vote, Conrad Whitmore formally offered Adrian the position of interim chief executive, a natural step given everything he had uncovered and everything the board now understood about his background.
Adrian turned the offer down without much hesitation, unwilling to accept a title that felt more like a prize for conducting an investigation than a role he actually wanted to carry. He was equally unwilling to return to the kind of demanding, all-consuming career that had once pulled him away from the parts of his life that mattered most. The same career he had walked away from years earlier after his wife's death left him raising their daughter alone. Instead, Adrian recommended a seasoned operations director within the company, a woman with nearly 2 decades of hands-on experience, to serve as interim chief executive in his place. For himself, he accepted a newly created position, Vice President of Operational Integrity, with clearly defined working hours and a direct line to the board that did not require anyone's permission to use. His one condition, non-negotiable and written directly into the new policy, was that every employee in the company would have access to a reporting channel that did not pass through their immediate supervisor, so that no one would ever again feel as trapped as Mara had felt when she first noticed the numbers did not add up. Conrad accepted the condition without argument, recognizing it for what it was, a lesson learned the hard way and written into permanent policy so the company would not need to learn it twice. The new interim chief executive, a woman named Diane Sutter, who had spent 18 years climbing through the operations side of the business, thanked Adrian privately for not taking the position himself, admitting she had assumed for years that people like her would never be considered for a role that had always gone to someone with a different kind of pedigree. Adrian told her plainly that the company needed someone who understood how the business actually functioned from the ground up, not someone chasing a title for its own sake. And he believed she was exactly that person. Diane's first act as interim chief executive was to personally walk the warehouse floor on her first morning, introducing herself to workers by name rather than summoning department heads to a conference room, a small gesture that nonetheless spread through the company within days. Word of the change in tone reached even the suppliers and outside partners who had grown accustomed to Victoria's brusque manner, and several of them remarked cautiously at first that dealing with Ashbourne Dynamics finally felt different. One longtime vendor, who had quietly considered ending the partnership months earlier, told Diane directly that the shift in leadership had restored a measure of trust that had been eroding for years without anyone at the company seeming to notice. When Mara later asked Adrian somewhat privately why he had never revealed who he really was sooner, his answer was simple and unhurried. Authority only reveals the truth about a person when they believe the one standing in front of them holds none of it. And Victoria had shown her true character precisely because she never once imagined that the quiet man leaving work on time to see his daughter might be the one person capable of ending her career. Months later, the true revenue figures at Ashbourne Dynamics had begun a slow, steady recovery, built this time on numbers that actually meant something. Adrian still drove the same aging pickup truck to work every morning, and he still left the building at the same hour every evening, unwilling to let a new title rewrite the priorities that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. On his desk sat a new nameplate, sharper and more official than anything he had worn before, and taped carefully to its back was the old, scratched warehouse badge he had worn the entire time this story unfolded. A new hire noticed it one afternoon and asked, half-joking, why he bothered keeping something so worn out and outdated. Adrian told her that it reminded him a title could change how quickly people chose to respect him, but it could never change what he was actually worth, a distinction Victoria Ashbourne had never learned to see in anyone standing beneath her. The young woman nodded slowly, clearly turning the idea over in her mind, and asked one more question before heading back to her station, wondering out loud whether he ever thought about what might have happened had he simply stayed silent about the shipments that first Tuesday. Adrian considered the question longer than she probably expected, then admitted that silence had never really felt like an option available to him. Not because of any grand principle, but because he had spent too many years watching people get hurt by problems that someone, somewhere, had chosen to overlook. He had learned, both in his old career and in the quiet months since, that the people most easily dismissed by those in power were often the ones paying closest attention, precisely because they had less to lose by looking honestly at what was in front of them. Victoria Ashbourne had spent her career surrounded by people who agreed with her, and in the end, that comfort had cost her everything she had built. Adrian, by contrast, had spent his career being underestimated, and it was that same underestimation, so often used against him, that had ultimately given him the room to do what needed to be done. Just before he switched off the light in his office that evening, his phone buzzed with a short message from his daughter asking if he would make it home in time for dinner again. Adrian smiled, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and typed back 2 words without a second hesitation: always will. If you enjoy stories where character matters more than status, subscribe for more like this. Thanks for staying with us to the very end. Outside, the parking lot had mostly emptied for the evening, and his old pickup truck sat exactly where it always did, unremarkable among the newer cars around it, waiting to carry him home to the only title that had ever really mattered to him.